Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and it's time to take a look at the March Balance Pass for cards. So, we are about to land in the Season of United Front, which is the latest mini-expansion for cards, and all my coverage for that particular mini-expansion is going to be in the same playlist that this one is in. You'll see my thoughts on the rotation and the cards when we've seen them all. But as is usual, when we actually get a new mini-expansion, we also get a balance patch, so I'm going to give my thoughts. As ever, I am a Kards Content Creator, member of the Contributor Program, kind of a new player advocate. I spend a lot of time concentrating on content for kind of new players and ways to improve your game. Anyway, you can find all of that down below with the links. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Maybe come join me on Twitch when I'm streaming. If you feel like it and you're able to, you can also hit me up through the links below to support the channel, whether through Ko-Fi or through Patreon. Anyway, the main meat of this is going to be going through bit by bit the balance patch that we have just received. So, as usual, I'm just going to go through it, give my thoughts on the cards, and see what we think of the latest balance patch. So let's jump in. Right, balance patch, March 2025. So, what have we got? Hello friends, new release, new balance patch, I'm not going to go through all of this because it's kind of pointless. Let's pick out a sentence that we can focus on. Right. Here's the section that we can kind of focus on this, which is the explanation of where this balance patch is coming from. As usual, I will declare in advance because I think it's key. I'm always big on being open. I am in internal testing, so I have given some thoughts on various cards and changes, but I am restricted in what I can say about that process and what was involved in it by NDAs, but that in no way affects or changes my opinions on the cards. I just give my complete and open opinions, sometimes rather bluntly, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Anyway, so the meta has seen a few decks rising slightly above the rest, mainly ramp, self-damage, and Soviet control, but their edge is so slim that pretty much anything goes, and it's possible to get decent results with any old deck. Okay, so this is where I start with the maybe not moments. So, yes, and yet no. So, ramp, self-damage, and Soviet control, particularly Soviet Italy control, have been insanely prevalent. When you're making your run to Field Marshal, once you get to about rank 6, that's pretty much all you're going to see. There will be the occasional person playing something else, but for the most part, this is what's out there, and they are very, very... I would say their edge is more than slim. In particular, the self-damage can snowball very, very quickly, although we are seeing some changes with that. Have a look at the rotation. They are losing Stand Together, which is a pretty big hit, but they're still going to be very playable. Ramp remains ramp. Its credit acceleration's always been really good. But anyway, you can get results with kind of, I wouldn't say any old deck, but if you can get on a decent deck, you can probably get to Field Marshal on it. I'm not going to guarantee you're going to have a good experience doing it. Anywho, aggro is weaker, though, than it has been for a while. Yeah, this is very true. With all this in mind, let's take a look at what we have in store for you in the upcoming balance patch. Right, so... yes, aggro has been substantially weaker lately. Straight-up aggro decks have just not been that effective. Japan aggro, although you can still get decent results on Britair, which is an aggro deck, by the way. It's nowhere near as good as it was, but it's there. So, yes, aggro decks have been weaker. And I'll be interested to see whether we resolve things. Anyway, so as usual, we're going to start with nerfs. So I'm going to take a sip of coffee, and then we're going to go... It is the morning, I'm having coffee. I've just had my B12 injection, come home and I'm recording, so I'm caffeinating. So we're going to go and have a look at the nerfs. Obviously, we'll just go through them as we see them, and I'll give you my thoughts. And possibly talk you through the commentary that we're given by the dev team. Right, let's hop on to the first one. Okay, so the first nerf is the one everyone's been waiting for. This is first responders, and people have wanted to see this card nerfed for quite some time. There's been kind of an outcry for nerfing this card for a while. I was on record as saying when this got buffed from 4K to 3K that it didn't need it, and it was probably fine at 4K and could be used for people just sleeping on it. Once it hit 3K, this card became absolutely insane. It's reached the point whereby it's such a good value tool that it's being run in basically any Brit deck. I've even seen people run it in Brit Air. I don't know why, but I have. I wouldn't, but anyway, we're not here to talk about deck building. But people have been calling for a million different changes to this card for a while. I've seen some wild and wacky changes called for, and some more kind of subtle ones, and then just roll it back to its original stats. And I've been on record, because we've been through one change cycle, and I've been on record as defending the fact that this is not the easiest card to balance, and I think it actually is a good sign in some ways that it's taken a while to find a change and go with it on this card, because the danger with this card is too much of a nerf and it becomes utterly unplayable, not enough of a nerf and it remains a completely ridiculous overvalued card. Anyway, let's talk about the nerf that we've actually got. So, the original card, this is for those of you who are listening in audio, because I know a lot of my listeners do actually listen to this like a podcast, and if you do, I know you've said it, you find it helpful if I read out the card text. If you don't, you can always skip forward a few seconds. The original card, as on screen, is 3-cost countermeasure, and it says at the end of the enemy turn, add a 5th Brigade to your support line with +1/+1 for each enemy unit. 5th Brigade, of course, is a 1/5 British Guard. So if your opponent has 4 units on the board, it becomes a 5/9. And this is kind of the issue. It can snowball, especially against go-wide decks. This can get utterly insane. And the stats can get to the point whereby this thing is really, really difficult to remove. And yes, there is removal in there that can target it, but it's very, very oppressive because it is a standard card. So, what's the change? So the change now is that it's the same cost, but it now says at the end of the enemy turn, add a 5th Brigade to your support line, give it +3/+3 if the enemy has 3 or more units. Now, I know there are people who are going to say this is not enough. There are people who are going to feel like this is nowhere near enough of a nerf. I will point out this is a very, very significant nerf. Not only does this cap the stats, which I totally agree has to happen, it makes the buff a conditional buff that can blank. Now that's important. This card is now very play-roundable. If you see your opponent holding 3 credits, and you're not in any danger, you can just pass your turn and they end up paying 3 credits for a 1/5 guard. It's so bad for them. You can trade your units out, you can find a way to remove your units, you can see it coming and the things you can do. Yes, of course, if you have 3 or more units when this pops, it does come down as a 4/8, which is a very, very good guard. But it's not utterly insane, and it's still 2 cost, so you can still pop it with anything that targets 2 cost or less stuff. And it is popping on turn 3, so for example, if you've got anything that targets its attack, it's not insane to reach. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't a very good card. It is. This is still a good card. This is still a good card that will probably see a lot of play in decks that want to stall out. I just don't necessarily think that this is going to see the level of play that it has done, simply because it's become a lot more conditional. Obviously, there's wait and see, but I'm personally of the opinion this is a good change. It's well considered and well balanced, and I think makes first responders a good playable card that has value in a deck, and you can still have some fun with it as an OTK tool if you want to play around with Kangaroo OTK. But it's not insane. It's not bonkers. It doesn't just spiral out of all control as easily as it did. So overall, I am actually very pleased with this change. I respect the fact that other people won't be, but I actually think this is a good change. Anyway, let's go and see what's next. Next, as it turns out, is another card that I think is going to fall into a very similar category when we start talking about the change. This is the 4th Guards Rifle. this is a card which has seen an insane amount of play. Basically, if you have it, you are including this in any Soviet control deck and any Soviet self-damage deck, because it's just an insane value card. The original card is the 9-cost, 2-op cost, 9/9 guard with Blitz, which on the face of it is a very expensive card, but the card text is the killer, which is if in your hand, reduce the cost by 1 each time the enemy draws a card. This was utterly insane. The value on this was bonkers. This is such a good value card. It is an elite, which I will always remind people means you're not always going to see it. But honestly, you're seeing it enough, and you can end up playing this so cheaply. You can very easily put this down and blitz it forward for next to nothing. Just by being patient with it, and at the right timing on this is bonkers. So this is a very, very strong card, and people have been asking that it needs to be adjusted. But making that adjustment, we have to see what we've got, and I think there are some people who are going to like this and some people who aren't. So the change is really simple. They've just removed Blitz. Like, everything else is the same. It's the same stats, the same unit, the same card text, same op cost. Everything else is the same. The difference is it can't blitz. Now, on the face of it, you might argue this is not really that much of a thing, but it actually really is. Because this is no longer a really good offensive tool. You're not able to just pop this down and trade with it, or throw it into the front line to stall out super quickly. It puts this back in the realms of just being in line with stuff like Corson. Soviets are not short on insanely good value guards. This is just another one. This is definitely still going to see play in Soviet control decks. It's just not likely to see play in self-damage or any more aggressive deck to the same degree anymore, because it doesn't have Blitz, and Blitz was frankly egregious on this thing. It really didn't need it. Again, I'm really positive about this change. I think this is a decent, well-thought-out change to a card that definitely needed a change, but I didn't want to see utterly obliterated. It's still insane value. You're still going to see it played. It still fits into bonkers Soviet elite guards, but without Blitz, it becomes a lot less scary. And I'm all for that. I don't have a problem with this. Let's just see where we are when it comes to it. But as I say, I just don't think you're going to see this quite as prevalently as we have done. I think it's going to become what it was intended to be, which is a really good control tool. Right, next up, another Soviet card that we saw in Blood and Iron. This is 12th Guards Mechanised, and this card has singularly been the most enabling card for Soviet decks that I've ever seen. This card made a huge difference, because this card gave Soviets something that they badly needed, which is a draw engine. Anyway, 12th Guards Mechanised, the original text, as ever, 1/1, so 1 cost, 1 op cost, 1/2, smokescreen unit that becomes veteran when you deploy a tank with 4 or more attack. When it becomes veteran, it becomes a 2/2 when you draw 2 cards. This card is just really, really good. It's insanely good. It is just great value draw for a nation that desperately needs it, and fits beautifully into any aggressive deck. Self-damage loves this because it sits so beautifully with the SU-76 that it's hard to see why you wouldn't do it. I should also point out the veteran has Blitz, which I think is Blitz. I think the veteran has Blitz. Anyway, the veteran you can trade with when it comes through. I don't know whether it has Blitz, but the 2/2 veteran remains the same. What they've changed is they've swapped the stats, so it is now a 2 attack, 1 defense, 1 drop. Now, this looks again like a small change, but is in fact a huge change, because this makes this card vastly more removable. You can sickle this thing. And that's massive, because obviously with Smokescreen you can't trade it. I'm glad they didn't remove Smokescreen. I know some people wanted them to remove Smokescreen. That would be too much of a nerf. I think switching it to a 2/1 is a really good change, because it puts it in removal range without completely and utterly nerfing the only draw engine that is consistently good for Soviets outside of playing lots of Sickle. I love that this card is still really good and really playable. I don't think we're going to see this card any less. I just think we're going to be able to deal with it better, and that's a good thing. Honestly, this is, again, a change I am super pleased with. I think it's really well thought out. Next up, we have a card that I really was blinking to try and remember when I saw that they were changing it. This is the Inniskilling Fusiliers. I am British and part Scottish, so I'm going to remind people that the correct pronunciation is Inniskilling, even though it looks like Inniskilling. The Inniskilling Fusiliers, just no one played this card. It's a 5 cost, 1 op cost, 4/6 infantry that has, when you play a card with intel, deal 2 damage to a random enemy. Nobody played this card. I don't think I've even seen people in intel decks trying to play this card. Now, the push here is interesting because what they've done is just dial up the intel damage so that it now does 3 damage rather than 2 to a random enemy. No, right, it's still a random enemy, it can still hit HQ when you play a intel card. I mean, this is a decent buff if you want to see Intel seeing more play, and it's very apparent that they do, and I know people have been flirting with Intel decks for a while. But I really, honestly, is it going to make that much of a difference? I don't know that it is. I don't know that, without guard or some other reason to make this an infantry that you want, this is less good. I mean, technically you can cover it up with a guard, which makes it slightly annoying to remove, which I guess is kind of the point, but it's 5 cost, which means it's quite late, and you're talking about 3 damage to a random enemy, which can go well or can go very poorly, depending on your situation and where you want that damage to go. That said, I do think we are going to see some people playing with some British intel decks, because there are some other cards that support this. So the jury's out on whether this is actually going to take intel to a playable deck, but it's certainly interesting. I will probably play around with it. There are cards out there that support this, but this is not, for me, massively gonna move the earth. It's interesting, and it's nice to see them kind of leaning in the direction of, look, this is a thing that we'd kind of like to see take off and bring another deck into playability. Is this it? Probably not, but we'll see. And it is a buff. It is, despite the fact that it is 1 point, that 3 damage versus 2 damage can be a significant buff. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. Okay, it's cascading commentary time. This is Wolfpack, and this change is not going to be popular with many people. This is going to be a very polarizing change. So Wolfpack is was a 5-cost German special order that says, send target unit to owner's hand, the enemy discards a random card. It's a discard card. Discard is a thing in this game. It's not a very strong thing in this game at the minute. But there are other cards landing in the expansion that are leaning more in this direction, and this has just been changed to a 4-cost order that says, send unit to owner's hand, the enemy discards a random card. Do not sleep on the fact that Wolfpack is a very, very good card. Wolfpack at 5 was a very good card. It had the potential to be incredibly potent. It could neutralise a threat. You could take something that had been buffed beyond belief, pop it back to your enemy's hand and force them to drop it, but without the buffs. If you timed it right, you could send your enemy's biggest threat to it and have a 50-50 or even a guarantee on that card then being discarded. This card is strong, and at 4 this card only gets stronger. This is going to cause people to lean into trying discard. Now, how much that is a good thing is questionable, because discard, like Mill, is one of those decks that, while interesting to build and a very effective control tool, is frankly at times deeply unfun to play against. And I don't know. I don't know how people are going to react, because I don't know how viable / prevalent discard is going to be, and that's going to be the key with this card. The key with this card is not the buff to the card itself. The key is there enough buff to the deck archetype that this card fits to make it actually worth playing? And you're going to have to catch up with the rest of my content to see whether there is or not. But I will say it's starting to become much more viable than it was, and for some people that won't be a good thing. I'm not too bothered by it. In the great scheme of things, discard is just something that... Discard and mill are two things that, after 30 plus years in card gaming, and I just reached the point whereby I'm used to their existence, and as long as they don't get ridiculously strong, they don't bother me that much. You just have to learn to deal with them. But I do recognise that that can be a very unfun experience, especially for players who are newer to the game, so it is going to be worth keeping an eye on. For what it's worth, I don't know that this card needed the buff. I really don't. I think you could have just driven discard forward with some more support cards and left Wolfpack alone, and it probably would have still seen play. But we will see. Right. This is Covert Operation, and this is all about the covert mechanic. So covert operations, I did a lot of coverage from when the expansion dropped, and one of course the big thing that it brought was the covert mechanic, and then it's gone absolutely nowhere. Nowhere at all. Just doesn't do a thing. People have tried it a couple of times, and frankly it's terrible. It's just stayed awful. On paper, there was a US-Soviet or Soviet-US deck out there somewhere that should, in principle, have been able to do something cool with Covert. But it never did, because Covert was just too slow. So the Covert mechanic is one in which you play a card from hand. All the units that are Covert cost 3 credits. All of them, regardless. You put it so you never know what it is, and you play that card face down, so your opponent doesn't know what it is. While it is face down, it is a unit, but it is not targetable by orders and stuff like that. It doesn't trigger countermeasures, and it can be pushed forward into the front line or operated for 1 credit. When you operate it, or when your opponent attacks it with a unit, it flips and usually does something. In theory, this is a really cool mechanic, and one that looked like it was going to be quite fun. But it just died stillborn because, unfortunately, it's too slow. Because there's no way to accelerate it, because you can't use an order that lets you push your covert units forward into the front line or something similar, because they can't be targeted by orders, and not even your own. Anyway, covert operation was 4-cost order, and it said add the top covert unit of your deck to your support line. It's a Soviet order, and it's 4-cost to get a 3-cost card out and put it on the board. So it's draw and play a 3-cost card for 4, which mathematically is reasonable, but nothing to write home about, and it didn't do anything to help, so it was just too slow, and therefore no one bothered. Covert Operation now is a 5-cost order. However, there's a reason it's gone up in cost, and that's because its text has been substantially buffed in an attempt to accelerate and bring some life back into the covert mechanic, and it now says add the top covert unit of your deck to your support line. Duplicate it. So now you pay 5 credits to take your covert card, your 3-cost covert card, put it in the support line, and put a copy of it next to itself. Now, in principle, this could be huge, because this is good value. However, whether it's going to be enough to see Covert actually see play, I don't know, because it's still slow. That said, playing this is going to feel good, and I'm certainly interested to give it a go to see if Covert can work, because I've liked the idea of Covert, and there are some very cool Covert units out there, So, in principle, this could be really good. It could be really fun to add, and accelerating the Soviets is something I am definitely glad to see. I'm kind of interested to see where it goes, but I don't know. I don't know whether it's going to be enough, but I do like the fact that we're trying, and I hope that we continue to try to make Covert into something, because there's a good batch of cards out there that I would like to see play, because they're actually interesting, and so is the mechanic. So it's a change I'm happy to see, pulled out of largely nowhere. I don't think anyone was particularly thinking, oh my god, they need to buff Covert in this patch, but they have, and I kind of like that. Right, P-51 Mustang. This is US 6-cost, 6/4 fighter with 2 op cost. It's a limited card, and it says deployment, deal 4 damage to a random enemy air unit. And nobody played this card, really, outside of draft. They just didn't. It was pretty decent in draft, because in theory you could pop an enemy air unit and get a decent body on the board, but really it wasn't seeing constructed play, because why on earth would you? Which is a shame, because it's got beautiful art and is an interesting idea. Anyway, this is now going backwards, so it's P-51 Mustang is getting buffed back, because I believe this was nerfed down from doing 5 damage to a random air unit to doing 4. It now does 5 again, so the rest of it remains the same. And I actually do expect to see this card see play, particularly in some ramp decks, because there's a lot of air support coming out. And air is already good, and it's getting some buffs. And if we see a big resurgence of air decks, the stock on this card goes up heavily, because 5 damage to a random air unit removes most air units, and that's strong. Plus, it gives you a really good guard against bombers, because it's a good statted fighter. I think this probably will see some play in air counter decks. How much play it sees, I don't know. This might be a 1 or 2 of in ramp decks, or maybe some other US archetype that we've not seen yet, but I mean, it's not going to make it into Throp, which is the other US deck that I kind of expect to start seeing people play around with at some point, although I'm endlessly expecting people to play around with it and they don't. But yeah, I don't mind this. I think it's probably smart given the buffs coming to air. We'll see how much play it sees. But I have no objection to this change at all. None at all. It's just a nice little alteration to bring the Mustang back to being functional. Right, this is the 77th Regiment. Right. A little bit of composed bear here. So this is a 3-cost, 1-op cost, 2/4 Japanese infantry with blitz and shock. It is a special card, and its original text is, after this unit shock attacks, add a 20th Infantry Regiment to your support line. 20th will appear. Right. So, okay. The key here, obviously, is to understand what shock did. Shock is the attack buff. So long as a unit has shock, when it makes an attack, it takes no retaliatory damage on that attack, and then shock is used up and goes away. So basically, the first time you attacked with this, if your opponent didn't get to it first, you got no retaliatory damage and popped a unit onto the board. Wooten yay. Really didn't see a lot of play. Fine. We've decided to buff it. Okay, kind of sort of also fine, so let's get to the buff. This is now a 3/4 infantry. Decent buff already. 3 attacks, a good buff. And then they've changed the text, and the text is, after this unit destroys a unit, add a 20th Infantry Regiment to your support line. I really don't like this change. I really don't like the design of this change. I don't like the concept of the design of this change. This has the potential to get stupid. Why, Bear, is it so much of an issue? And the answer is because this is technically unlimited. Not only is this unit now better at dealing damage, which means it trades better, and shock made it trade well already, now every time you destroy something with this, you get an extra unit on the board, and you're pretty much, the whole point of this is it's gonna fire at least twice for a grand total of 5 credits, 3 to play it, 1 to attack the first time, 1 to attack the second time. Getting 2 more units on the board, I don't like it, and there's a very good chance it'll fire a third time with 4 defense, or if there's a way that you can find to keep it around. I really don't like this. I don't like this change because I don't like anything that's snowbally, and this has the potential to get very snowbally. I'm not a fan of this change. I'm kind of hoping that it's not going to be that impactful because I don't know how much this is going to see play, but I kind of think this is going to go and see a fair chunk of play in Japan aggro, because realistically it's free units, and free units is never nothing. It's just one of those things that I'm not a fan of, is anything that can just spontaneously create free units, especially given that it already has shock, so that it's protected, and that kind of... I don't know, there's a point for me. Like, yes, the 20th, as noted, you can probably still see it on the screen, is a 2/2 guard unit, so it's not that special, but it's effectively free. And free is one of the great design sins to be very careful of. Anyway, we'll see. It's not so much that I think this is going to be massively oppressive, it's just that I don't like the design concept. It feels very strong. Anyway, we'll see whether I'm right or wrong, but this is one of those changes I'm not the world's biggest fan of. We shall see. Another Japanese infantry change. This is the Hirosaki Brigade. So this is a 3-cost, 1-op cost, 2/4 infantry with smokescreen. Limited card, and it says when a friendly unit loses smokescreen, it gets +1/+1. This is the smokescreen enabler card. There's the bomber that can do the similar thing, but it's more expensive, and there are some other bits and pieces out there, but this is the core smokescreen enabling card. I've played around with this. I've played around with some smokescreen recently, and it's been pretty good, actually. And Hirosaki is pretty strong. So we're buffing it. Smokescreen's been on the edge of being a very good deck. In fact, I think it's better than people think it is already. And now we're buffing the smokescreen deck with a change to Hirosaki, and the change is tiny and yet significant. The unit remains completely identical, except in addition to getting +1/+1 when it loses smokescreen, it also gets -1 operation cost, and I personally think this is insane. I think it's mad. I think this is utterly bonkers. This is crazy because you're going to create loads and loads of 0-op cost high-stat units, and that's terrifying. I think this is very, very strong, and I don't necessarily think that it's going to stick. We'll see, but this is definitely... if the intent was to elevate smokescreen, this is going to elevate smokescreen, because operation cost reduction is huge. Operation cost reduction that also gives you a stat boost is insane. Do not sleep on the fact that this is a very, very good card, and we are probably going to see some meta smokescreen decks. Legitimately, this might enable some lunacy. This on its own is an incredibly strong change to smokescreen. And it's not the only one. Right, I said it wasn't the only change to smokescreen, and here's the next one. This is the Type 92 Jyu-Shokosha, and this is the 1-cost, 1-op cost, 1/2 smokescreen tank that gets +1 attack when it damages the HQ, and is a standard Japanese card. This card is good. This is a good card. I've played this card to good effect, both in just aggro decks and also in smokescreen decks. It is a good card. It's getting buffed. It's getting buffed by giving it operation cost 0. Again, operation cost is huge. This is a very strong buff. Now, of course, it does mean that this can't benefit from the previous buff, because it can't be reduced to operation cost -1, thank the Lord, and the card doesn't have Blitz. However, this is still a 1-drop with 0-op cost that has a spiraling attack increase. do not sleep on the fact that this card is very, very good, and this is another really strong change to Smokescreen. I wonder if we're going to see Smokescreen get a bit too strong, but we'll find out. But this is not a small change, because one of the best things you could do with Smokescreen at the minute was to turn 1 this, and then on turn 2 be able to play the order that gives it operation cost 0, buffs it if it has Smokescreen, and then push it forward. Now you kind of save yourself the trouble of putting the order down. Alright, you don't get the buffs, but it gives you an extra credit to play with, which is critical in any aggro deck. Again, this Smokescreen will become an aggro, kind of a delayed onset aggro deck, in effect. And any time that's the case, 0 op cost becomes the most important thing. You go back a ways, No in 5 came up with an insanely good deck a few seasons ago that just leveraged 0 op cost, and absolutely, I had a blast playing it and did a whole video on it, which is probably still on my channel somewhere, explaining why 0 op cost is just huge, and leveraging it can be game breaking. Honestly, keep your eyes on Smokescreen, because I think it's about to get very, very good. Right, this is a French card. This is the Bloch MB152. This is the 3 cost, 2 cost, 2/3 heavy armor 1 special fighter that had your units do not lose mobilize when damaged. And I thoroughly expected to see a change to this card when it wasn't rotated out, because it was made clear in rotation that we were clearing Pincer and Mobilize from the game. When this card was removed, or rather when other cards were removed and this card was not, when it stayed in it, I expected at some point we'd see a change, because of course Mobilize is irrelevant, so it has to do something different, and it does. So this is just a fairly simple change. So this card now, it goes to being a 3/3 fighter. Still, everything else is the same. It's still heavy armor, it's still 3 cost and 2 op cost, and it gets deployment. If this is the first unit you deploy this turn, draw a card. I love this card. I think this card's really good. I don't think this card's insane. I think this card's just good. This card leans into something I've talked about repeatedly, which is seeing France lean more and more into becoming an ally for more mid-range and value decks, where it is giving you units that have good stats, good value, and effects that allow you to play the mid-range game, and a 3-drop that draws you a card and then has a good body is decent. It really is. The op cost is a little restrictive, but not the end of the world. It guards nicely against bombers, so it can counter air, which is also going to be important if you're trying to play a mid-range deck and get some frontline presence whilst dealing with air, which is something that's going to happen if you go in that direction. Look for me to try this out for a while when this patch drops, because I know that one of the decks I'm probably going to try out is US-France Frontline, because I think we're starting on mid-range, I should say. We're starting to see more and more cards in that direction, and I think we might have reached critical mass where it could almost be good if it can just hold its own in the meta. I love this change. I think this is a very sensible change that turns this into a good value card, which you can include and then move from there. I kind of would have liked to have maybe seen it gain a point of defense and lose heavy armor, because I don't know that heavy armor is actually that good. But then again, when it's countering air, if you've got an unbuffed bomber, this is really good, because this hard counters a swordfish, because it has exactly the right amount of damage to remove it when it attacks, and exactly the right amount of heavy armor to mean the swordfish can't trade into it. Not that that's going to happen very often, but just something to be aware of. It also is good against any one attack fighter, so heavy armor in an air battle may actually be more valid than it currently is on the ground. But anyway, you could have done some different things with this, but on the whole, I really like this as a change, and I think it's a very sensible one. To Poland, and we have the Zaza division. So Zaza division was always an interesting card. 4 cost, 1 op cost, 2/5 infantry with blitz and fury. It's a special card, and it says when a friendly unit survives combat, give it +1 attack. I mean, this was an interesting card to play around with. It could let you try and snowball some Polish cards, But it wasn't really that well played, because honestly, it wasn't that good of an effect. So we're changing the effect. We're keeping the card. The card remains identical. Still 4-1, still 2-5 statted with Blitz and Fury. But now it gets, when this unit takes damage, draw a card. This is Draw Engine. Draw Engines are always good. Again, we've seen Poland starting to get more and more cards that also lean into a more kind of mid-game, mid-range support. We've seen some cards that have various bits that do that, and this fits into the same grouping, and now that it draws a card, this isn't at all bad, especially considering it's got 5 defense and Fury. You could trade out really well into like go wide decks that don't have massive attack with this, because you can easily pop this twice. And you in effect get to do 4 points of damage and then get 2 cards, which isn't terrible value for 2 credits. Technically 6 if you played it before, but you can get some good value out of this, and that's interesting. Is it interesting enough that it's going to see a lot of play? I really don't know, but I like the change. I like the direction of the change. Draw is important. I was banged on endlessly in videos about the fact that people undervalue draw, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of newer players in this game end up getting frustrated, because they build decks around having all the cool units and undervalue draw and don't have enough of it in there, and then they're never seeing the stuff. But anyway, I like this. I think it's an interesting change. It's still a very heavy card. It's just a little, at 4 cost, I think this is a little heavy. As this is in effect 6 cost if you really want to drop it down and use it, and I think on T6 this might be, I would kind of have liked to have seen this go down to a 3 cost, even if it had meant fiddling around maybe with its defense a bit. But I still think this is pretty good. I really think this is a pretty decent change, and I think it's going to be interesting to see whether people play it. Whether people will or not, completely different question, but it's an interesting change. Okay, that's it. That is the whole balance patch. On the whole, I quite like it. I think it's pretty decent. I think it's been reasonably well done. As you can see, there are a couple of things I'm less of a fan of in there, but on the whole, this is a pretty satisfactory patch to me. It's not done anything overly egregious, and it's addressed some problems that I think needed addressing in what I consider to be fairly sensible ways. Smokescreen notwithstanding, because eep, smokescreen, that's going to be worth watching. I actually think this has done a really good job, and I think I will be interested to see how it impacts the meta. As ever, I hope this has been interesting. I hope you found it helpful. Please like, follow, subscribe, all those things that I hate asking you to do, because everyone I know who's a content creator says the same thing. I hate asking for it, but if you can like, follow, subscribe, and even if you're able to support the channel in some way through the links down below, that does make a huge difference. It is one of the things that's able to keep me doing this. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm still going to be covering cards, and you're certainly going to see more coverage coming from me for United Front. So keep your eyes open on the channel. And as ever, be good humans, stay well, and I'll catch you next time.